and then Executive Director of the Portland Community Reinvestment Initiatives. Once the panelists have spoken, I will then open it up for questions. We'll now proceed with the meeting, and I will start by introducing Mayor Ted Wheeler. Mayor.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining me to discuss the state of housing in Portland during this pandemic. I want to begin by thanking everyone who's coming together in our community and supporting their fellow Portlanders, caring for us and our loved ones in the hospitals and medical clinics, finding new ways to teach our kids, stocking our shelves, filling our online orders, and helping to keep our city services up and running. Portlanders have really come together in a heroic way during this pandemic, and I want to thank everybody for helping to lift the community. Yesterday's smoky skies, the gusts of winds, the power outages all reminded me that I also want to thank the men and women across our state and across the region who are working hard right now to fight fires, working to clean up our neighborhoods, and making sure that everybody has access to electricity. Thank you for those of you who worked all day yesterday and all night and are continuing to work today. As we grieve the 487 lives lost to COVID in our state, we recognize the many ways that this pandemic is hurting our community and challenging us to find solutions. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the problem of housing affordability. This is a critical issue to many Portlanders. And even now, in the midst of a pandemic and its resulting skyrocketing unemployment rates, when we know that safe, stable housing is critical to maintaining the public's health, we're continuing to hear about rents going up, further challenging households that are already struggling to make their rent payments. Throughout this time, your city leaders have been working with partners from government, the nonprofit community, the business community, the philanthropic and faith communities to deliver meaningful relief. In March, the city and the county adopted a 6-month moratorium on evictions for those unable to pay their rent, because ensuring that Portlanders stay in their homes may be the most important thing and the most effective action to keeping everyone safe during this pandemic. With the city and the county's moratorium set to expire at the end of this month, we've been working against the clock to deploy resources to stem the tidal wave of evictions we anticipated back in October. In August, in partnership with Multnomah County and the Joint Office of Homeless Services, we committed a $35 million deployment of state, local, and federal funds to provide rent assistance to the thousands of Portland households. More than 20 mission-driven organizations, including longtime city partners, are working overtime to ensure that these dollars are reaching residents who need them the most. Yet, we know that these limited resources won't go far enough to meet the tremendous need in our community brought about by the pandemic. And as a result, we are very concerned about what happens in October with the, as I say, a so-called tidal wave of potential evictions. Just last week, Governor Brown and the Centers for Disease Control and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's director, Robert Redfield, have stepped in to extend the eviction and foreclosure protections throughout the remainder of this year. I want to thank Governor Brown and her staff, especially Housing Policy Advisor Shannon Singleton, as well as CDC Director Robert Redfield, for using their authority to extend the foreclosure moratorium and the eviction moratorium respectively. These extensions serve as a critical safeguard. My office and the Portland Housing Bureau have been researching solutions that the city can employ absent additional federal or state actions. I want to thank the many organizations, community members, and businesses who are working with us and helping all of us to address the anticipated tidal wave of evictions and foreclosures. With these extensions now in place, we can focus on helping Portlanders who will have to make up for missed rent or mortgage payments. The bill that our community will collectively have to pay when these moratoriums expire looms large in my mind. We hear this concern in nationwide campaigns to cancel the rent. But this is not a simple problem. The housing market is complicated. Figuring out what to do about your late payments or how to renegotiate the terms of your contract is stressful. And research and building consensus for policy and funding solutions is complex. But the consequences for not doing it right or on time are very real. So I'd like to do something a little bit unusual and actually walk you through a PowerPoint presentation with the data. I want to make sure that we start with a common understanding of what's happening in the local market, the severity of these impacts, in particular to people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and in particular, and the puzzle pieces we must put together in order to be successful with our actions. This PowerPoint presentation and the information materials will be posted on the Mayor's Office website. We'll also email a copy to every one of you who have registered for this press conference. And so with that, we will start the PowerPoint presentation. The Portland Housing Bureau produces a State of Housing report annually to give us the most comprehensive and up-to-date data on our local housing market. Similar to many of our peer cities, nearly half of Portland households are renters. The demographic breakdown also shows us that while 43% of white households in the Portland area are renters, the proportion is significantly higher among many BIPOC communities, with as many as 74% of Black households renting their homes, 74%. Next slide, please. Because of the significant growth Portland has seen recently, our rental market is tighter than in past years. Even prior to COVID, our community faced a housing affordability crisis. And based on the 2019 State of the Housing Report, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Portland was roughly $1,500 per month. And 1 in every 2 renters were considered housing cost burdened, which is the term we use to describe people who are paying more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. Again, that was 1 in every 2 renters. As you can see, not only are many Portlanders cost burdened, 1 in 4 are severely cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 50% of their monthly income on rent. This means that even prior to the pandemic and its resulting economic downturn, too many Portlanders were just one medical crisis or family emergency or job loss away from potentially being homeless. Next slide, please. This graphic shows who in Portland rents their home. You can see that a majority of those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color are renters. Renters are typically more vulnerable to cost of living and rent increases that can lead to displacement, an issue the city has been working with the community to address through a suite of policies and budget investments. Next slide, please. By housing affordability standards, a renter in Portland would need an annual income of at least $60,000 per year to afford rent in the city. But as you can see here, those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color disproportionately earn much less than that. Next slide. Further, these residents are disproportionately employed in service occupations, or as we hear often, essential workers, where they're at a greater risk of losing their jobs, losing part of their income, and having to work in settings that expose them to the virus. Next slide, please. When you take an holistic view of this data altogether, it shows us that missing a rent payment has a substantially greater impact on those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Once again, our most vulnerable have been set up to fail. On average, Black and Indigenous households in Portland pay 40 to 60% of their incomes on rent. At pre-COVID income levels, it would take the average Black family in Portland almost 6 months to save up enough to repay just 1 month of back rent. Even with an eviction moratorium in place, a 6-month grace period to repay back rent, and a temporary measure in place to keep residents in safe, stable housing, we are only postponing a much bigger problem without some bold action within the next 4 months. Next slide, please. Since May, between 12 and 15% of Portland renters have been unable to make their monthly rent payments. Among what are called Class C properties, which tend to be the older buildings and those located farther east, the rate of non-payment during the pandemic has been closer to 20%. That means Portlanders who've lost their jobs or have lost their incomes and are now making under the area median income are falling further and further behind. Next slide, please. Doing the math, about $25 million in rent is going unpaid every month, 25 million. Next slide. In 5 months, if non-payment rates stay on the same trajectory from May through September, Portlanders have fallen $120 to $125 million behind on rent. This is having a devastating impact on renters and property owners alike, who are unable to pay their rent, their mortgages, and their property taxes without income. This also brings into perspective just how great the need is. Even with our governmental partners coming together to invest $35 million in rent support and household stabilization, we still need more funding to prevent the tidal wave of evictions and foreclosures. We need our federal and our state partners to step in and work with us to address the needs of renters, landlord, and property owners during this crisis. I want to thank Governor Brown for her leadership in proactively addressing the complicated problems that this data depicts. Our state legislature, our United States Congress, and our president must act, though. We must have unified, coordinated actions to help all residents weather this pandemic in safe and stable housing. Next slide, please. Again, this slide further illustrates what we already know. Non-payment rates are higher for those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, families, and low-income renters. Now, I want to share 2 key relief measures that I'll be asking my colleagues to support. These measures are intended to prioritize housing stability and keep all of our community members healthy and safe during this crisis. I want to thank the many communities, business, and nonprofit partners who are helping the city develop COVID-19 relief measures, from the Economic Recovery Task Force to the Renter Assistance Working Group, and of course, my fellow commissioners, especially Commissioner Chloe Daly, who is a steadfast advocate for renter protections. Over the last several weeks, my team has researched tools that local governments can use to help protect Portlanders whose housing stability is jeopardized by this pandemic. While local governments obviously have less authority and fewer resources than our state and federal partners, I'm confident that the complementary actions we take locally will bring needed relief. First, I will be introducing an emergency council action that will lower the threshold for mandatory relocation assistance so that any rent increase triggers this resource throughout the remainder of this year. Today, a rent increase of 10% or more triggers relocation assistance. Right now, with thousands of renters not able to pay their current rent, it's likely that any rent increase would force renters to have to relocate. While we're in the middle of this pandemic, we need to do our part to protect renters from the tidal wave of evictions that we know is coming. We need to support renters who may need to relocate due to rent increases. We also need to make sure that our local property owners who rent their homes to Portlanders are not foreclosed upon because of any unnecessary added costs that make it impossible for them to pay back their loans. Secondly, I'll be directing the Portland Housing Bureau to allocate approximately $500,000 with existing funding going towards housing stabilization. The Portland Housing Bureau will allocate this funding based on the trends that I've shared in the data. We must prioritize relief in East Portland and those who are severely housing cost burdened. I also want to preview a potential third action. I'm prepared to extend the city's eviction moratorium through the end of the year by executive order. I want to again acknowledge the leadership of the CDC at the federal level to ensure that there's a base level of protections for renters. For consistency purposes, it's important that we extend what we've already passed locally. Homeowners and small landlords need protection right now, and so do renters. Again, we have a lot of work to do to truly solve the underlying problem, and that will take bold leadership from the state and the federal government, as well as strong local action. And it will need to be honest that the market operates as one entity. The well-being of residents is closely tied to the health of financial and lending institutions. To best help renters and homeowners, solutions must consider the whole system and account for both intended and unintended consequences. A safe, stable, and affordable home is the foundation for a healthy life and an effective COVID-19 recovery strategy. Portlanders are counting on us to help them weather this pandemic and economic storm, and I'm proud to work with my council colleagues and our many community and business partners to take these actions. Thank you. I'll now turn this over to Michael Buonocore, the Executive Director of Home Forward. Michael, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Buonocore, and I'm the Executive Director of Home Forward. And we are the agency that runs the public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher program in Multnomah County. Last month, we sent out letters to almost 300 landlords that house thousands of our Housing Choice Voucher participants to let them know that we would not be approving rent increases that are requested starting September 1st through the calendar year of 2021. So just a quick word on how the Housing Choice Voucher program works. Home Forward directly pays a portion of people's rents to landlords based on each household's income to make it affordable for them. The maximum amount of rent we'll pay is capped based on the number of bedrooms each household is approved for. Once per year, landlords can request an increase in the rent as long as it's reasonable based on the market and within our rent caps called payment standards, we approve it. And that's what we're freezing now. There are a couple of key ways the Housing Choice Voucher program is impacted during this economic crisis. For Home Forward, we're now paying about $100,000 per month more in subsidy to make up for lost income of our participants, specifically due to COVID-19, which is about an extra $1.2 million per year. We also have people who are renting apartments above our payment standards and making up the difference themselves. And sometimes that makes sense for families in order to be closer to work, their children's school, public transportation, and so forth. In these cases, when rent is increased, families have to absorb all that cost themselves because we're already paying the maximum subsidy. We know that locally and nationally, economic and health crises hit people with low incomes the hardest, and that people of color are burdened even more. One data point from our own program that demonstrates this is that we see about 23% of white households get rent increases each year, compared to almost 40% for Black and Latinx households and 43% for Native American households. So it's important to do what we can to minimize these disparities and keep people safely housed. It's been about 15 years since the last time we froze rent increases in the Housing Choice Voucher program, and we don't do it lightly. This is a terrible environment for tenants and for landlords, and our goal is to keep rent payments flowing so there is as much stability for everyone as possible. The reality is that rent increase freezes and eviction moratorium are temporary measures that require federal intervention in order to avoid catastrophe. As Mayor Wheeler said, our local governments are pushing millions of dollars into the community to keep people housed, but this is a national emergency that demands national solutions. We call on the federal government to provide emergency rent assistance to help pay rent arrears and support renters in the months ahead. Thank you again for your time today. I'd like to pass the Zoom camera to Kimberly Horner, the Executive Director for Portland Community Reinvestment Initiatives. Kimberly, it's all yours.
Kimberly, this is Tim. You'll need to unmute, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Michael. My name is Kimberly Horner. I am the Executive Director for the Portland Community Reinvestment Initiatives. We lovingly go by the name PCRI for those of you who have had access or some interaction with our organization. PCRI has been around since about 1992, so we're about 30 years in the game of providing affordable housing to the northeast section of Portland. One of our main goals is to make sure that the African American community in particular has clean, decent living standards in addition to affordable housing options. As a result of illegal mortgage practices and gentrification occurring in the northeast section of Portland, there's a very strong need for Black Portlanders to have access to housing. With the pandemic occurring, there has been a substantial, even greater need to provide housing for the most vulnerable population of people that are being impacted by COVID, and that is the Black community. So I am here today to advocate and work with the city as well as Home Forward on solutions and options to help keep people housed. Our rent alone has been decreased greatly as a result of people in the Black community and low-income residents in our portfolio losing jobs or simply not being able to keep up with the rent because they've had a reduction in hours. Since about April of 2020 this year, we have seen approximately $361,000 in fall off from rents being collected from our organization. This is pretty significant and needs to be addressed immediately because we are that organization that does provide affordable housing options for people, but we also have mortgage payments that we need to make to the banks as well. So as rents fall off for our organization, it makes it very, very difficult for us to keep the lights on, as most people say, and keep people housed in safe living conditions. We recently have worked with the city of Portland to access 3 specific programs that will be dedicated to residents in our portfolio. And that is mortgage counseling. That is a program that is being funded through the CARES Act and coordinated through the city of Portland. And that is where we will provide mortgage counseling to individuals that are falling short on making their mortgage payments. In addition to that, there is funding that the city through the CARES Act has made available for those individuals that need mortgage assistance. You have to income qualify and demonstrate the hardship, but if you do, there's approximately or close to $6,000 that we can help individuals with mortgage assistance. The second program that we're working with the city of Portland is additional funding for people who are just experiencing financial hardships, particularly those in the PCRI portfolio. There is approximately $500 in bank cards that will be provided to individuals to help offset some of the costs that are that they need assistance with in terms of making purchases for food, medicine, and things of that nature that they can no longer afford. What we are looking to do is pair with our local elected officials as well as the federal government to have a stronger conversation about how to keep people housed during this pandemic. We understand that there needs to be additional time put on the clock so that evictions are staved and people can stay in their homes. But come December 31st, when those provisions are eliminated, we know that we will have a group of people that still need some assistance in terms of either making, in terms of being able to answering questions and working collectively to come up with solutions to figure out how we're all going to move through this pandemic, particularly in areas that support the most impacted group of people, which is the African American community. And with that, I will turn the rest of the presentation over to the mayor and his staff for further questions.
Tim, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Well, there's that. Let's try it with the microphone open. Okay, we're now going to open it up for questions, and reporters would ask that you please hit the hand raise icon on your computer there if you do have a question. And I want to remind you, the focus of this press conference is housing stabilization and rent relief. We ask that your questions relate to that topic, and we'll be happy to answer any other questions unrelated to the topic outside of this forum. So let's begin with the hands raised. How about start with Pat Doris, KGW. Pat? Pat, you have a question, and who is it for?
Yes, trying to ask a question to the mayor. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
We can hear you.
All right, great. Well, my first question was going to be about the nightly violence, but I'll be polite and move on to the housing issue. So, Mayor, as I understand it, then you have two things that you're trying to propose. One is stopping any rent increases, or at least triggering that rental assistance requirement, which would, in essence, stop that. And then making money available. Is that going to be enough, though, between now and the end of the year if everybody's living right on the edge?
The answer to that question, Pat, is unequivocally no. It is not enough. And that's why I'm putting an ask in here for our state partners and our federal partners to continue to work with us to get our arms around the magnitude of this problem. With $120 to $125 million in back rent payment due, that's far more resource than the city of Portland can provide. We already put $35 million of our CARES Act into rent assistance, which supported the ability of families to stay in their housing. It also ensured that our local building owners and landlords would continue to have revenues so that they could pay their mortgages. But the reality is the problem here is much bigger than the resources we have at the local level alone. So what I'm proposing will help, but it will not in and of itself be sufficient.
Okay, Pat, no more questions? Let's go on to Everton Bailey from the Oregonian. Everton, who's your question for?
Good morning. Thanks for taking my question. My question is for Mayor Wheeler. Mayor, back in, I think it was April, the Portland City Council sent a letter to state and federal elected leaders calling for all rent and mortgage payments to be forgiven. And so I was wondering if you can provide any update to the public on that. I mean, is the city going to continue to advocate for removing state barriers to allow rent and mortgage forgiveness, or has the city given up on that?
So the short answer is the city has given up on that because there just is not an interest at other levels of government of moving those two things in tandem. And look, here's my concern about the hydraulics of this market. As you know, Everton, there's a call nationally to, quote, cancel the rent, unquote. And I certainly understand the anxiety and frustration that renters have, because under the current scenarios, what's happening is they are not paying their rent, but they will eventually have to pay their rent. So in effect, what is happening is there is a bill that will come due down the road, net of any rent assistance that we can provide. As I say, we've provided $35 million so far, but we cannot possibly make up that $100 to $125 million. My concern is keeping people in their housing during a pandemic, but I am also keenly aware of the economics of this market and the pressures that in turn puts on building owners and landlords. If they are unable to pay their mortgages, they will potentially lose those properties. And we all saw what happened in the 2008, 2009 economic collapse. Was a lot of our local housing, and we saw this nationally, a lot of the local housing ended up in the hands of sovereign wealth funds, insurance trusts, and private equity portfolios. And I do not want that to happen either. And I want to thank those building owners and landlords, and I've met with many and I've spoken to many who have already reached arrangements with their tenants to do everything they can to support them and keep them in their housing and not increase their rent during this crisis, putting further burdens on people's ability to pay their rent back. So I want to applaud and acknowledge that building owners and landlords have been valued partners in this conversation. But the work we can do right here and now together in the community through shared sacrifice is keep as many people in their homes as possible throughout the remainder of this public health emergency. Housing is directly tied to public health in the midst of a pandemic. And we have to acknowledge that as the baseline situation we're facing as a community and as a nation.
Thank you. I do have one more quick question if I'm allowed the opportunity.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, awesome. So Kimberly Horner touched on this a little bit. So the city has provided, $500 gift cards and other resources to people, through local community organizations. And Mayor, I believe you mentioned that it's more than 20 groups that the city is working with to continue to distribute resources. But the reach of those groups can only go so far, even within the BIPOC communities that they're set up to serve. And so I was wondering if you can elaborate on what the city is doing to provide aid to people outside of those networks.
Yeah, so I would probably defer to Kimberly Branham if she was on the call from Prosper. I don't believe she is on the call. Shannon Callahan, our Housing Bureau Director, is on the call, so I'll defer to Shannon. But we are basically putting money into three sets of resources, and I'll generally line those up. First of all, we are supporting small business owners and operators. The first $2 million that we deployed, and remember the City of Portland deployed resources before the state or the federal government to support small business employers. Since a lot of people in this city, in fact, the majority work for small employers, of the first $2 million that went out the door, 90% of it went to BIPOC communities. And as we have now deployed over $20 million towards those resources to support small employers, we've continued to put that focus on lower income and equity and diversity and putting those issues front and center in our deployment. The household support, our initial household support was over $8 million. And that was not only for the rent assistance, which ultimately we added another, I think it was 30 million in rent assistance. Sorry, $35 million in rent assistance. Sorry, I was fact checking there. But also household critical investments during the COVID crisis. And I'm sure Shannon has other details that I don't. Director Callahan.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Everton, for the question. We're actually right now working with a group of culturally specific providers, new providers that the city and county has not had relationships with in the past, to try to expand our reach into the BIPOC communities. We're actually working on contracting with approximately 40 new partners as we speak, both on the rent assistance program and then on the direct household assistance program that both Kimberly Horner and the mayor spoke about. So putting out approximately $13 million in direct cash assistance for families who need help surviving during the COVID crisis.
Okay, we have another question. Anyone else have any more questions? There was a hand up earlier, but I'm not seeing any hands up right now. No more questions? All right, well, that'll do it then for this press conference. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I will be sending out a press release that does have all that PowerPoint information that was shared earlier by the mayor, along with some other information that you may need. So please reach out to us if you have questions on other topics, and we'll do our best to address those as well.